Hello and welcome to the Human in the Machine podcast, the podcast about all things HCI. As ever, I'm your host, Professor Ben Cowan. For this episode, with the full chat I had with Dr Kevin Doherty, whose talk you can catch in the previous episode. We've decided to split these so that people can dip into the chat and the talk separately, and I also just really liked the insights in the interview and thought they were due an episode themselves. Again, thanks to Kevin for being such a good sport with all the questions. The audience were really engaged with the questions, and I think these brought out some really nice points of discussion throughout the chat. Again, if you like the podcast, please don't forget to review and follow us. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can by emailing us at humaninthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. Let us know what you think of the topics, if you've got any ideas for speakers, or you'd like to hear from us, or just leave a little nice message for us. All will be welcomely received. Without further ado, here's the chat I had with Kevin. So please sit back and enjoy. First of all, Kevin, thanks very much for joining us for a chat about this. I found your presentation fascinating about the idea of interdisciplinarity. I just wanted to get a sense of your experience of that aspect of interdisciplinarity and how you feel it works and what happens when it doesn't work. Like, what are some of your experiences around, the failures and also the successes? What's your experiences there?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I spoke at the end of the talk about the importance of being able to do this work in very sustainable ways, and I think that is very important. So particularly when you're working in the health context, for example, the responsibilities can be quite significant for the work that we're doing when, a mobile app we build, for example, is being used by people to support their sharing of how they're feeling with health professionals, which has implications for their care. That work can be stressful, and I think it's important that we take those responsibilities seriously. And for me, doing that work in interdisciplinary ways can actually enable that. It enables it in terms of having that additional professional support, knowing that others are involved in the work who have the experience and the expertise that can complement my own. But also it enables it in terms of sustaining it. So in maintaining the joy that's involved in that work that often is felt in interaction, in conversations, much like this, about the nature of the work we're doing. I think that's inherently important to sustaining that kind of work that we do. So I think that's one of the real joys of the work. I mean, successes you can count, of course, in terms of the outcomes, publications, more importantly, the impact on care. I talked about the work we did in the UK's NHS, for example, and that project was ultimately quite a successful project, most importantly for me in terms of the positive experiences of the women who use the tools that we built. And the challenges are, many also. But I think as researchers, often I think as people who are interested in design, we're interested in problem solving, in tackling complex problems. And those can be human also. So I often find it quite interesting, as much as it can be difficult at times, to figure out how do we negotiate these relationships? How do we make this work?
I think that's one of the things that's always underestimated when it comes to doing interdisciplinary work as well, is the fact that it's about relationships, really. I think there's a lot of that success comes down to communication, effective communication, and respect for the disciplines that are involved as well, I think. And I think that's, I wonder whether there's, where you see these things kind of working as where there's a kind of a clear problem that's being solved. I know you mentioned that in your talk about the fact that, we're looking to solve problems, not to look at boundaries. Is that one of the key ingredients, you think, that everyone's going for the same problem or going for the same goal when you're coming across that?
I think often particularly in some of the larger projects I talked about, there are multiple problems, and often everyone has a different idea of what the problem actually is. So that is a challenge. But I think it's also something that you can work to develop a better understanding of. So one of the kind of initiatives that I developed in the work I was doing in Denmark in particular was we would hold regular workshops where we would have all the team members sit down and actually ask, what do you think is the problem here? What is the vision that we have for solving this? And yes, we might have different views on the aspect of that problem that is most important. So for the computer scientists, we might think, that we need this data to be able to, inform this decision. Whereas for a general practitioner might be more important that they can introduce this technology in a way that isn't going to damage their relationship to their patient. And those are all legitimate problems and all kind of at the heart of what we're trying to solve here. So I think one thing that I found important, and it sounds quite abstract when you say it, but it is important to have a kind of coherent vision that you are working towards the same objective. And yes, you will have differences, and so it's important sometimes to be able to air those differences in, not necessarily heated ways, but in ways which leave you feeling heard. But it's also important to be able to move forward after it.
So there's got to be a bit of conflict resolution, is there? Is that the kind of,
I think it's a useful skill, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things. I mean, because both of us have experience doing interdisciplinary research, and both have experienced the kind of the successes and the failures. And I think you're right. Actually, there's an element of conflict resolution that has to be incorporated within that, and respect for those disciplines too. I mean, one of the things that really fascinates me about your work in particular is working in that area of technology in a space such as healthcare, where it's quite high risk if it doesn't work. So what are some of the things that you found whenever working in that area of healthcare that are important to reflect on, especially if you're coming in with a number of disciplines and a number of different approaches and what success might look like? So what's the, do you ever get nervous doing your research in healthcare in that area, or if the tools don't work as planned or as expected, and these things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question, actually, and for sure. I'm involved in an academic research community interested in emotionally demanding research, and some of the work that I've talked about is quite emotionally demanding. When you're doing this kind of work, you bring a lot of yourself to it often. You I think, usefully and importantly take responsibility for the choices you make, but you also feel that responsibility at times. And so I think when it comes to deploying systems, for example, in real-world practice of care, it's important that there is a sense of cohesion, that there's a team there, that you have, of course, protocols in place to handle whatever may happen, but also that you are working in a safe space where there is some support from your colleagues, where you feel comfortable sharing how you are doing and how that work is progressing.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing for people who are looking to not only study but to research and to work in that space as well, is to think, to hear about that reflection and to hear about that it's emotionally demanding work, and I think it's a really important message for some of that. I mean, what are some of the coping strategies for that? Is it kind of like more of a collective kind of sharing of things, or is that built into a project plan? Is that built into the way that these things are approached? Yeah.
But before I answer that, just to talk further about the interdisciplinarity and how that affects that kind of ways of working, it also means that often and increasingly we're doing work, perhaps as engineers or computer scientists, which have implications for people's health and well-being. And that's not necessarily something we're trained in the way that a psychologist might be or a psychotherapist might be. And so that's a skill set that, as someone new to that kind of ways of working, you don't necessarily have. And so it's important to be able to develop coping strategies, to develop, as a person, as an individual, to be able to handle those challenges. But I think it's also important for colleagues involved in these projects where you recognize that some of your collaborators might not have those skills, that you provide those supports. And I mean, to answer your question more specifically, I've seen several instances where funding has been built into funding proposals for work in the mental health technology space, which might involve funding for therapists, for example, for people who are involved in that work. And this is something that would be standard practice for people who are doing work around mental health and difficult topics like bereavement and grief and mental illness in the fields of psychology and psychotherapy and so on, but it's not a history that we have as computer scientists. And so I think HCI as a field can play a role in developing individuals who have that kind of shared experience and can share that again across disciplines to create kind of safer and healthier ways of working for all of us. Well,
that brings me on nicely to the aspect of HCI as a transdiscipline or to being an interdisciplinary space. And I know you highlighted Alan Blackwell's great paper about this discussion that we should embrace that, and I think that's really true. How do you think HCI is evolving in that situation? I think that you're mentioning there that some of the skills that people from the HCI domain might be developing might be integral to those types of projects, and having people like that would be integral to those types of projects. How do you think the field is evolving and embracing that element of interdisciplinarity and beyond, as you've highlighted in the talk there about the different types of concepts that we have?
Yeah, I mean, I brought this topic today in part because it is a very open-ended topic. We don't necessarily have answers to these questions, but it's a very active area of research and implicit to the ways in which many of us are working. So I very much appreciate Alan Blackwell's take, and it's something that I can relate to very closely, in that often as a researcher involved in these kind of projects, that's what I would do. I facilitate conversations. I kind of ask difficult questions sometimes. I encourage conversations, introduce new perspectives, and also have some understanding of the different perspectives different people are bringing. I mean, at the same time, there's kind of an emerging school of thought in HCI that is trying to strengthen HCI as a discipline, that is very focused on developing kind of theories at the heart of HCI. So for any research field, kind of what defines that field is often the theories, the epistemologies that underlie it. And I think some of that work is also very legitimate and admirable in terms of building towards cohesive HCI theory, but it's certainly in some ways at odds with another way of viewing HCI as an interdiscipline with no particular home. So I think they're really interesting conversations, and I think one of the also important aspects of doing interdisciplinary research is being able to hold these different perspectives at times, recognizing that's an open challenge we don't have a clear solution to, but we can still move forward, make progress towards the problem we're trying to solve that's in front of us.
I always think that with HCI in particular, that's a huge superpower of the discipline to some extent, where we can hold those two things in our heads, that core discipline that you have, as well as seeing the connections across many different spaces. And I think that actually your work, I think, highlights that an awful lot, that the connections being made around the number of disciplines like design all the way through to kind of healthcare, human factors, and also the kind of core disciplines that are required around, especially with machine learning and healthcare. I think that's a really kind of important thing. I mean, is that something that you think that as a discipline we embrace potentially a lot more than others, or are other disciplines catching up with that, or are other disciplines better at it? So not to have a discipline competition, but is that something that you see in other disciplines as well?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't want to embarrass the other disciplines.
That's right, exactly.
I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say that HCI is the only field that's embracing these kind of questions, because I think it's far from the case. Kind of another area of science emerging which has been focused on these topics is implementation science, and that's kind of a way of working that we would often encounter as HCI researchers, which again makes an effort to embrace this broader range of theory. I mean, interdisciplinary research is something that's being very much promoted, in terms of the funding bodies for research, and in terms of the ways in which we speak about the value of what we do. I think one of the advantages that HCI has in this respect perhaps is the design as a foundation of the field. I talked about this a little bit in the talk, but I think design is a practice for tackling kind of complex problems which don't necessarily have a clear solution, but we're working towards some kind of resolution. That way of thinking is actually a very useful one when it comes to embracing interdisciplinarity in itself. So I think that is a valuable element that HCI brings in particular to this kind of broader conversation.
Well, you mentioned design there as well. I wonder, I had a kind of a potentially provocative question around the aspect of design here. And so do you feel that, as a person who is clearly at core in terms of the aspects of understanding design and design practice and elements like that, do you feel sometimes that maybe that the term is a bit abused by some of the work that is conducted in the field? And is there something that do we need to think a bit more about the kind of terms that we're using whenever we're conducting that? I thought from your presentation there was a really nice breakdown of what design is, and I think that sometimes we use it in a very kind of fleeting way. Whereas actually, I think your presentation gave a lot of depth to what design is as a concept. I don't know if there's any reflections on do you think we overuse the term?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for saying that, Ben. I don't know about overusing the term, but I think often we mean different things by it. And so recently I was doing some work with Dr. Kevin Doherty from Trinity College, where we were developing a set of methods cards for use by designers in industry to better integrate health technology acceptance theory into their design practice. And I think that's an interesting example of trying to bridge academia and industry, which addresses these kind of different approaches to design. So I think in academia, we often have quite a good theoretically informed perspective on what design is as a research method even. But sometimes the work we do could benefit from simply design skills, the ability to actually build technologies in a professional way, drawing on professional skills to develop attractive, intuitive interfaces, for example. So, whereas industry, on the other hand, could also benefit from the kind of theory that we can bring as HCI researchers, particularly research methods, which can better inform the choices they make based on their knowledge of their experiences of their users. So I think design as used in industry and academia is sometimes dichotomous, and that's worth reflecting on in particular. I mean, I could talk for a long time about differences in language use. I said I was at a seminar on interdisciplinary healthcare teams just previous to this, and many people in that seminar were talking about the interventions they design. And what they meant by interventions was actually training sessions for health professionals. Whereas, as health technology developers, computer scientists, when we think of an intervention, we think of something quite different. It could be a mobile app based on some behavioral principles, for example. So even, narrowing down to that level of the language you use can be helpful actually in having better conversations.
I think that's definitely one of the things, that kind of shared language. I sometimes find that quite tricky in HCI in particular, because we all come from, with different viewpoints about different disciplines, and so the shared language and the shared terminology can sometimes be quite challenging. And I think that the point that you made there is definitely bang on the money, where it looks at this idea that we need to think about that language that we have and build that common ground about those particular terms. I think that with the aspects of interdisciplinarity, I imagine a number of people in this room will be thinking, right, okay, if I'm in an interdisciplinary team, how do I make that work? So any tips for anyone in the room or listening online about whether how to make those interdisciplinary teams work?
Well, this is something we will talk about this summer, but I think one thing that's important is voicing your role in that team. So what do you think are your skills? What do you think you bring to that team? And what do you want from this project that you're working on? If it's a project, for example, or what do you bring to this problem that you think can complement the other skills in the team? So having those conversations is really important. I think teamwork is an interdisciplinary but also interpersonal endeavor, and so I think it's important to recognize others' contributions, to show gratitude, to be kind, to be respectful, to give others time to be seen and heard. So I think culture is as important as strategy when it comes to forming teams, and it's a process. It takes time to get to know each other, to get to know each other's ways of working and so on. So
I think there's some great tips in there, I think, for all of us. I mean, not just people in this room too. So I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. So we have a mirror board set up here. And we're going to be selecting some of these questions. So I'm going to scan them. There's a lot of text in some of these. So first one is, so hi Kevin, so can you please talk more about your comorbid research or your comorbidity research?
Yes. So comorbidity, which essentially defines the presence of one or more parallel illnesses, is increasingly of interest, particularly when it comes to physical and mental illnesses. So people are living longer today with more chronic conditions. So with diabetes, with heart disease, with physical immobility. And these have implications for our mental health as well. So often in the health context, we're increasingly thinking about trans and multidisciplinary ways of working as, not myself, but among health professionals, towards ways of tackling the kind of holistic perspective of health. And some of the work that I've been doing in this context, I can mention again, the work I was doing in Denmark, for example, really had at its heart recognizing that for those experiencing mental illness, their physical health is just important. And it is important that the focus on their mental health does not come at a physical cost. And so, again, this is a challenge in the healthcare context because health professionals see themselves as having their own expertise, their own area of focus. So a cardiac surgeon, for example, is not necessarily going to consider it within their expertise, the mental health of their patient. And yet at the same time, the conversations they might have with that patient around surgery actually have a significant impact on their well-being. There's been some interesting research which shows the impact on the success of various medical procedures that the doctor shaking the patient's hand when they enter the room can have. So there's been some really interesting work that has shown these unintuitive significant differences that can arise. And I think that's something worth exploring more and something I'm trying to do in terms of the ways in which we make use of the data that we can gather from patients.
So we've got one here as well about how did you and your team measure the impacts on your previous digital mental health projects on the targeted real users? So I think it's a really interesting question about how we measure impact of our interventions, or using interventions in the term for HCI. But how did you measure those impacts, and how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's a good question also because it again implies a different kind of skill set. As designers, we talk about working in an iterative way where we take users' feedback on board to inform further design decisions we make. But when you're deploying a technology in medical practice, the kinds of evidence that we want to develop tend to be more stringent. In much of the work that I've done, I've focused on feasibility and in particular on engagement with these solutions. So do patients and health professionals engage with these technologies that you deploy? Do they use them? Do they facilitate conversations? Do they enable sufficient data gathering to support the kinds of outcomes that we'd like to see? So those are kind of some of the trends that I would focus on in my work, while also working with other health professionals who would focus on, deeper analyses of the kinds of data that we might gather, including patient-reported outcome measures and so on.
I think here's another question going back to interdisciplinarity here. We've got a number of questions actually about how these projects work, and I think that's a really interesting kind of area to explore a lot more as well, I think. And so we might look at exploring that in a discussion in later periods on the podcast too. But so we got a question here. In interdisciplinary teams, you mentioned that one of the benefits is to take advantage of each other, obviously in the best possible way, to better solve problems. So are there any best practices for determining the optimal degree of difference or similarity that team must have to enhance or get optimal problem solving?
I'm not quite sure that's how I phrased it.
No, true.
But it's fair enough. I think it's a good question. I mean, the question implies that there is kind of some quick fix here, or some neat breakdown of efforts which results in a desired outcome. And I don't think that kind of guidance exists, or if I was to offer that it would be particularly helpful. So, I mean, I think it's important that you do bring skills that are complementary to a project, but also that you identify problems that enable you to use those skills. So, as designers, often when we're tasked with engaging some kind of complex real-world problem, we're given a brief, and maybe the problem that we're given isn't the real problem for our stakeholders. So often actually engaging with that problem itself and interrogating it, questioning it, and seeing, what can we bring to this with our unique skills. Maybe it's not the right problem for us to focus on. And I think that can be useful as well, to focus on kind of from the outset, making sure that you're focused on the right problem.
I think always it's every team's different as well, isn't it? I mean, and that's the problem that you're solving, and the makeup of each team is slightly different. So the dynamics are always going to change. You might work with people who you've worked with previously and you have a relationship with, so you can be much more honest about challenges or things like that, without feeling kind of that kind of social social anxiety or issues about highlighting problems. Well, maybe I'm speaking more about myself here. I have a lot of social anxiety a lot of the time. But I think there's a lot of things that are group dependent, actually, and relationship dependent in terms of history that you have across there. So there's an interesting one about the fourth wave of HCI here. And this is an interesting one that I found with HCI as well, that HCI itself seems to embrace an awful lot of different types of user, types, in fact. So things like animals and all those elements. So when we're talking about fourth wave HCI, that probably incorporates aspects of not necessarily just focusing on the human or the computer. And computer as well is one of those terms that, do we need to be a bit wider with that with that term? What are your views on that evolution of HCI in particular? Don't have to focus on the animals bit, or just that evolution of HCI in terms of fourth wave and looking at different users and different devices.
Yeah, I mean, I think these waves are a useful conceptual tool for talking about the field. In terms of the fourth wave as a transdisciplinary one, the idea here is that HCI is focusing increasingly on kind of higher order problems, on problems like sustainability, as opposed to, perhaps complementary to the usability of a particular interface, for example. And so I see this kind of fourth wave, as it's been described, as a way of kind of pushing HCI as a field towards striving towards seeking solutions to these higher order problems that might then have broader implications, broader generalizability across, many other domains. So I think that's a quite an admirable, striving ethic in which to engage.
I think the one of the questions as well here that I think is really important, that covers a number of the questions that we have on the board. Thanks very much for the questions as well, but keep them coming in, because I think they're really, really good in terms of getting a wider and deeper conversation around some of these topics. And I think this is focused on in one of the questions we have here, straying like the focus on a problem. Are there any ways that you have done in the past that you've tried to bring that back together, or try to kind of get more of a focus again on that project, rather than that sometimes people can lose track or maybe get deep into a particular issue and not necessarily see the wider picture? What's your experiences with some of that whenever doing that?
Yeah. Thanks everyone for the questions, and that's a really good question in particular. It's an experience I've had several times, particularly when you might be working on a project for a period of time, maybe even years, and then some point down the line, someone new comes on board and brings a new perspective. And sometimes that perspective can be helpful, but of course it always is driven by their own perspectives. And it can of course bring a project in new, interesting ways, but it can also prove decisive and quite challenging for people who've been working on this for a while and have some collective ownership over a particular direction. So that can be, I think, painful for people in these kinds of longer term projects in particular. And how you navigate that, I think it requires compromise often. That person who's coming onto a project is being brought on for a reason. They bring some new skills, some new perspective, and perhaps you don't agree with everything that they bring to the project, but I think you must be willing to compromise in certain areas to realize the value that they do bring in others. This is an experience I've had several times, and it can be challenging. I think it also requires leadership. It requires a clear vision. And I think an interesting concept that is being discussed in the literature kind of in recent years, this idea of collective leadership and what form that might take. So how can you have those conversations in a way where everyone feels like they're leading the project in a way that they feel heard, and yet also, enables this kind of compromise that is always going to be the case in all kinds of human relations.
Well, because there's always a temptation whenever thinking about the messy form of compromise to think about hierarchical decision making, and as you were saying in your talk so eloquently, I think that there's an element of that doesn't work, especially when you're looking at interdisciplinarity. And I wonder whether there's this aspect of collaborative leadership and collective leadership needing to be something that's focused on a lot more in terms of the processes that are involved. And I think that we naturally fall to the idea of like, well, if there's one person leading it, there's a clear vision. That's not necessarily true. That's not necessarily the case, and that can lead to a lot of animosity as well when it comes to different disciplines involved in certain things. So there's some aspects about dark pattern design in games in some aspects here. So and then thinking about that, bringing health design into account in different ways. So what are some of the aspects around that in terms of dark patterns and health? But also, and this is one of the things that I was wondering as well, what drives you into work in the field of healthcare? So what drives you in that element of bringing into healthcare technology? So dark patterns first, then why you do healthcare.
Sure. Well, the dark patterns comment, I think, relates to some work that I was doing also in Denmark with some master's students I was supervising there. And that was a really interesting project also, which touches on these questions about teamwork. And so in part of my research focuses on user engagement, and user engagement in many domains is a real challenge. In the health context, it's quite a challenge. How do we design an app such that users will engage with it, such that health professionals will use it and integrate it into their workflows and so on? It's a really big challenge. However, in some other domains, we're actually very effective at designing for engagement, and gaming is one of these domains. And so this project looked at the surfacing of dark patterns. These are kind of manipulative design patterns, ways of encouraging people to spend more time with games than they might otherwise report that they would like to, using kind of manipulative strategies like impersonating friends, loot boxes, gambling elements, and so on. But this work is interesting because the students who were doing the work, they actually focused on how decisions are made around the introduction of those dark patterns in gaming companies. And this highlighted some of the tensions between the designers, who are often very passionate about games, want to create joyful experiences for their users, and then work in a context where there are also economic incentives, business incentives, and where it's important to the commercial success of the company that gamers spend time on their devices. So it's an interesting example where these tensions surface that are very difficult to negotiate and don't necessarily have simple solutions. Which brings me on to the second question, which was about why I work in the healthcare context. I mean, there's various reasons I could speak to. I think you often have some personal motivation in terms of the kind of work you do. This could be experiences with family, friends in my own life. But also I think that I'm interested in problem solving. And in the healthcare context, there are some really complex problems, and they're often really quite intractable. The solutions are really unclear, and there can be some really significant challenges. And personally, I find that quite fulfilling, seeing what I can bring to the kind of approaches to solving some of these challenges, which also, of course, have a real impact on people's lives. So I've been lucky to be involved in some projects that have really, had an impact on a national scale in terms of people's experiences of healthcare, and that's of course quite a fulfilling experience.
Well, one of the questions I had as well that I had written down here was the fact that this. So you mentioned aspects in your presentation about profile, or about the elements of thinking about where you fit in with a profile of an interdisciplinary team. How do you feel that that's changed over your career? So how do you feel that you've evolved as an interdisciplinary researcher, and how what are some of the key experiences that you think people should get to maybe evolve as interdisciplinary researchers as well? What are the key pieces of advice about that, and also just reflecting on your own experiences?
Yeah, this is something I've found challenging myself. I mean, kind of many people in this room will have come from diverse backgrounds and maybe are pursuing this master's as a way of moving into a new area of study, a new area of work, and that requires you to balance these different elements of your experiences. And I think it is important that you are able to present yourself in a clear and concise way, particularly when working in teams, that you can express what it is you bring to these challenges. And I think one of the difficult parts of that is that it can feel sometimes like it requires you to let go of some part of your personality, your experience, your professional profile. And that's something I've struggled with myself over the years. So you heard my brief personal presentation at the start of the talk. And I mean, that's something I've worked on over time and still is fairly meandering. Now I describe myself as an HCI researcher, but it took me quite a while to actually focus on that label. For a long time, I described myself as an engineer who also does design work and also does some research and works in the computer science department and also public health department and is interested in mental health. And, while that might all be true, you leave people more confused than they were to begin with.
It's not quite as catchy, is it?
Exactly. So I think it's a really important question for everyone to think about. And I mean, it's something I'm still working on myself. And it's not just us also. HCI as a field is it can be a challenging one to present at times. Even the title, human-computer interaction, it can mean many things to many people. And so it does require a bit of explanation, but it requires you to do the work to know what it means to you.
I think that's a great reflection to end on, actually, is that, I think HCI is the power of that discipline is the fact that it is what it is to you, and to be able to reflect that in the work that you do. And I think that's a great point to end on there. So just want to say thanks so much, Kevin, for joining us today, and thanks for answering all the questions as well. So thanks very much. Again, thanks so much to Kevin for answering all those questions and giving us a really interesting insight into his perspectives on interdisciplinarity. Again, don't forget to review and follow us. And if you want to get in contact with us, you can by emailing us at humaninthemachinepodcast@gmail.com. All that's left for me to say is, I've been Ben Cowan, stay curious, and don't let the machines get you down.